Welcome to Keepers of the Word. You're here with Ron and Mike, and our special guest today is Darrell Rivers.
Indeed.
Well, today we're here to talk about the American Civil War and Masonry. We've known that this war started in 1861 and ended in 1865. However, there was reports and testaments of compassionate acts by the Freemasons showing a brighter side of those 4 years of strife and the unusual ways of war. Often fathers and sons fighting on opposite sides, as were blood and fraternal brothers and friends, was too far common. This allowed the light of Masonry to shine brightly even during those troubled times. And Brother Darrell Rivers is going to give us some examples of what happened during those times when brother was fighting brother.
So the first thing to set this up is Masonry was very popular in the middle of the 19th century. Historians argue about the data all the time, but it can be anywhere between 5 and 10% of at-age males belong to some sort of fraternal organization. Most of those would be Freemasons. You also have the Odd Fellows. You have a lot of other organizations that are around there, but it's a huge part of life during the Civil War. And it's because of that you're far more likely to see interactions between brothers. And it's not necessarily profound that the Masonry influenced the war. Nobody's saying that, but they're saying that good people were in that war and that good people had those compassionate acts, whether it be for burials, whether it be to spare a brother's life, spare a brother's property, help a brother's family. There are so many different examples of that, and they're really touching to read about. I think when you're in the history field, you finally get to the point, and this is probably a lot of different professions. You finally get to the point where you know how much you don't know. You ever had that?
Yeah.
Where you finally reach the point where you're, wow, there is just so much that I don't know. You know, you never trust the guy that says, oh yeah, I know all about that. So I've finally reached that point for Freemasonry and the Civil War, I think, because I stopped really thinking about it as something that you can just be the expert on, but there's really just thousands of experiences. And, we have in the historical record hundreds of examples of that you can share, that you can research and read. And so hopefully I get to share a lot of those. I kind of want to start with my experience with that, because I haven't written anything on Freemasonry and the Civil War. I'm not a particular expert, but
that's what I was going to ask, how you got started, what piqued your interest.
I get to work with the Civil War on a regular basis. I'm a historical advisor for film and TV, and I also do work with various historical projects around the country, and I run reenactments. And my family started some of the first reenactments out in California. So now, being involved in reenacting, that actually got me involved in Masonry. I saw a guy with a Masonic watch fob, just like a lot of the real Civil War stories. I saw a guy with a Masonic watch fob, asked him about Masonry, and he recommended that I go see Worshipful Grace. And he happened to be on the other side. I usually wear gray. I have all kinds of impressions, but I usually wear gray in the regular reenacting events. And I went across the lines and met Brother Grace, and he became my great friend and mentor. And we started to portray that in our reenacting world. So we started
using your Masonic connections as a story within your reenactments.
Yeah, and starting to build that, that we might have known each other before the war through that, or we might act like we don't know each other on the battlefield, but when one of us surrenders, we'll have some sort of recognition and we'll get some compassion across the lines. We've also held not a lodge, but a meeting across the lines where we had, we're at an event and the camps are pretty far separated, and we'll meet in the middle and have a Masonic exchange on the quote unquote battlefield. And we'll approach carefully.
Historically, was that something that
Yes,
actually happened?
yeah. And it is very common in the Civil War. And I think that's one of the weird things is you don't have that in a lot of other wars. There are great examples from the American Revolution. There's an instance of a British military lodge's jewels and their lodge furniture getting captured by the Continental Army in the American Revolution, and George Washington sends the stuff back. So there's a great example of that, and that's Revolutionary War is actually why I'm shaven this week, and the next few weeks is because I have working on Revolutionary War things. And in the 18th century, there's this cultural stigma about
Bearded
facial
gentlemen,
hair,
yeah.
and so I'm on a beard cycle. It goes from clean shaven to Civil War to Santa, and then back to Revolutionary War. So it's my cycle. But yeah, you see it in Revolutionary War, see it in the War of 1812, you see it in the Texas War of Independence and the Mexican War, you see it in the Wars of Independence in South America.
So it's
see it
prevalent in war in general.
Well, you see it in those examples, but not necessarily ones where the culture isn't that similar. You see it a little bit in the Franco-Prussian War, but you're not seeing it as much in, say, the First World War, or in a war that's between two very different civilizations, like the Opium Wars. You're not seeing it as much in wars against the Indian states, but it's that special circumstance where there are Americans who have a high prevalence of membership in the fraternity that are participating in this brutal war.
That were born out of England, English lodges, and so.
And I mentioned military lodges. Have you talked about military lodges
No,
before?
we haven't.
We have not, and we actually
Traveling
had
military lodge. Right?
Yeah,
we had a
it's one of
question
the
about that.
it's one of the most interesting ways in which Freemasonry has spread around the world. There's a great book, Builders of Empire. It's a great book to read about the influence of British Freemasonry around the world, and between lodges that got their dispensation from Grand Lodge of Ireland, Grand Lodge of England, Grand Lodge of Scotland, regiments in the British Army were given these usually 2-year dispensations to meet as a military or regimental lodge. And wherever they went, they would end up initiating people in that community. And so they, in turn spread Freemasonry wherever they go. And a lot of lodges then get their dispensations, recommended through regimental lodges. So a lot of the lodges around the world can trace their Masonic heritage through these regimental lodges. And that's actually how a lot of Masons during the Civil War get initiated, through these regimental lodges.
Oh, wow. So
I have a friend who was actually in Japan, I believe Okinawa, when he joined Masonry.
Wow.
So his mother lodge
Yeah.
is in Japan.
Yeah, that's great.
I noticed you have a couple patches right there. Is there a story behind those?
So the patches, the pins, it's a long history about yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk about each one of these. So there's also one out here that I had made with the eye on it there in the middle. There are a lot of stories about recognition. Some of them are for hoping to be identified, maybe to aim your rifle a little bit further to the left. Some of them are for body identification. There's a lot of really sad stories of just a symbol written on a piece of paper, pinned to a guy's uniform, because this is pre-dog tag. There are dog tags. We see dog tags and identification tags throughout the Civil War. A lot of them are privately purchased. And eventually we have the U.S. Sanitary Commission starts issuing these waxed paper ones that get used. But there's a lot of Masonic insignia, paper and otherwise, that get used. This isn't as common. This is a really nicely made bullion one. I don't think these were as common as handmade ones. And I actually had this made by a guy named Joe Valencetti in New Jersey. It's the badge maker on CivilWarCorpsBadges.com. But we designed this together to see what a hand-stitched version would look like. And there's the one with the eye in the center too. But I couldn't find the other two. But I have 4 versions.
Oh wow! We know
I have ones for my blue uniforms as well. And I had just taken mine off. I usually wear it here. It was a little ostentatious, and I was working on a show on the Discovery Channel. I didn't want too many questions being asked about that, so yeah. I took the patch off for it, and now I can't find it. But you can see all kinds of insignia. There's actually a lot of poo-pooing of the insignia in the reenacting community because there's not a lot of existing ones left, but the stories are there. There's always these letters of, I saw a guy with a Masonic pin, and he, was spared by this guy that didn't even know him. And there's a lot. Not all of the Masonic stories from the war are even from Masons. President McKinley. He would later become President McKinley. He started as a sergeant in the war and eventually became an officer. But he was working as an officer during I forget which battle, but he saw an act of Masonic charity. There was an officer that was handing out money from his own pocketbook to some other Masons, and he said, do you know these guys? And why would you do that? And he explained, I would, I'm helping my brother Masons. And he said, do you plan on getting paid back? And he said, well, if they can, perhaps, but I don't expect it. And he ended up, the quote is, if that is Masonry, I shall have some of it myself. So he went and joined one of the military lodges before the war ended even. And he was a Mason his whole life.
Wow.
Yeah.
And is there any specific stories that stood out to you the most about, interactions or, compassion, helping each other out?
Yeah, there's 2 stories that stand out to me about burial. And burial always stands out to me for some reason because my family's always been involved with cemeteries. My mother's on the Orange County Cemetery Board, and my grandmother was on that board for 25 years before she was. And cemeteries have that very historical connection. So I've always been intrigued by a lot of these burial stories. But there's a great account of the USS Albatross, and it's this gunboat along the Mississippi River. The captain contracts yellow fever, is having an absolutely miserable time, and shoots himself. They've been shelling back and forth with a rebel battery along the river, and they actually send a flag of truce over to those guys. And Masons from the town nearby actually come out and perform a Masonic funeral and give the captain a proper burial on this overlook. And you can still visit the grave today. But it's that's probably one of my favorite ones that and there are some other examples too of Confederate and Union soldiers coming together to bury a fallen brother. And it's not always so simple. There's a lot of examples of men getting shot at while they're trying to do this. But there are some really compassionate stories. There's one that even is very similar off Galveston. Galveston, Texas was under Yankee blockade. And there was a Confederate gunboat boarded another ship. The captain died during the battle, during this fight on the ship. And then they brought him, flag of truce, brought him to the shore. The lodge gave him a Masonic funeral. Wow. So there are a lot of these great stories about.
So obligation really, it really does mean something.
Yeah.
And I think remember that your obligation. You hear that a lot, and I feel this is a pretty good example of how deep that goes. If you think about it, you're at war. You're getting shot at. You could die at any moment, but at some point you put all that behind you because you see a brother or you see somebody that you don't even know. Some of those people you didn't even know, but you stopped everything to help, to change and make something for good. Mm-hmm. I just feel there aren't many stories like that, especially when it comes to war. And for me, the only place that I found that was in Masonry. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's very interesting that we have all these stories, but we don't have them all documented into one book. And it probably should be. And maybe that's something.
Well, there is the seminal book I will recommend. And I have to talk. I'm always going to go on a tangent like this, but my favorite book is called Better Angels of Our Nature, and I think it encapsulates that this is men being good during the war, and there are a lot of examples of that. There's another book, House Undivided, which is a little bit less academic, and there are a lot more Masonic anecdotes, but I don't think it's a lot of them are a little dubious. And I think you have that whenever you have Masonic scholarship. People are willing to take that extra leap, and they don't really look at it as a historian. They're looking at it, this is written for brothers. But Better Angels of Our Nature, hands down, I owe most of my understanding to that book. And Obligation actually brings up a really good anecdote from that book, is there was a Mason under court-martial, and I believe he was going to be executed. And this general gets written to by this brother, and we have his reply. And it's all about, yes, we have an obligation. That obligation is not valid when the brother is acting illegally. That we are not, bound to help him beyond, saving him. And there's a point where you can't help a brother. And this guy had repeated offenses. And so we have a great reply from a brother to a brother about the limits of your obligation. So it's a little more bleak, but that's another great story from it. Now, the one story I will mention that everyone has an opinion on, every serious Masonic Civil War scholar has an opinion on, and it's the incident that gets talked about with Freemasonry in the Civil War. Have you seen the monument Friend to Friend in Gettysburg?
No, I haven't.
Okay, it's awesome. It's great. It is a monument depicting General Louis Armistead dying at Gettysburg, handing off his pocket watch with a Masonic fob to Captain Bingham, a Union soldier. It's supposed to be this Masonic compassion in the battlefield. And it almost certainly didn't happen like that. So it's a great monument, and I think I like the monument still, even if it didn't occur like that, because it represents everything that did happen. There are a lot of accounts, including, I believe, House Undivided, that says he threw up a Masonic distress signal. He had some sort of call for help there were all of these Masonic things. I think some good men just happened to meet with him, and he happened to be a Mason. And I think a lot of the great Masonic anecdotes of the war are that. But he almost certainly didn't use a Masonic signal of distress, and he didn't hand off a Masonic Bible or all of these different Masonic connections. But he was this important general right at the high water mark of the Civil War. This is Pickett's charge. He was one of the commanders of Pickett's charge. Gets wounded right at the angle in Gettysburg, and as he's mortally wounded, he's actually friends with the Federal Corps commander, Winfield Scott Hancock, who also happened to be a Mason from his regimental lodge. But there just happened to be a lot of these connections. I don't think he invoked Masonry to get any special treatment. He was just kind of an important figure that as he was wounded, he was taken care of by the federal officers, and probably might have said something to someone he might have recognized as a Mason so that his stuff was taken care of, because his effects were given to his friend, the Union General Hancock.
Oh, man.
Interesting.
They're heavy. This is the heavy thing.
So of the stories,
Yeah.
do you think that there's more historical accuracies within the stories, or more anecdotal
A lot of
connections?
a lot of these come from non-Masons.
Okay.
There's a lot of stories that say this guy kept talking about his mother, who was a widow. And if it's not a Mason actually trying to say that, you wouldn't. He's not making it up. There's a lot of evidence, and I think when you read Better Angels of Our Nature, you'll see the academic approach to that.
Okay.
And there are some stories that you shouldn't believe, and some stories that are really well backed up. The other, I want to mention one thing that we haven't talked about at all, is the families. And some of the best stories are just ladies standing outside their door with the apron, or the apron is tied to their, a column outside their door, and they pass on by, federal troops that are, otherwise burning or looting or acquisitioning supplies and stuff. There are great stories about, asking for help, and the guy made sure that the family had enough food before the army moved on. But the best ones are the angry widows. There's one story of Union troops coming through her house. She said, I forget what her name is, but she tried to say, "Are any of you Masons?" And then she proceeds to start beating these guys as they're carrying stuff out of the house. It's not working very well. But then a Union officer comes up, and he's a Mason and makes everything fine. All the soldiers go on their way, and he places a guard at the house, and the widow was doing fine. But sometimes it was just the apron pinned to the door.
So clearly it was an important theme within the war that people understood the role of Masonry and how that would play
even
out.
non-Masons knew that there was this special treatment going on, even to a point where it annoyed people. There was you heard of John Singleton Mosby, and Mosby's Rangers. Confederate cavalry that was marauding through enemy territory, a fearsome unit, and he was known for hanging any Union officer he found. And one of his lieutenants was a Mason, ended up asking him to spare a couple lives, and it got to the point where he was asking too much, and he said, "Remember, this is an army unit and not a Masonic lodge." Might have said it a little more coarsely than that, but
I can imagine.
Yeah,
I mean, it is war.
Yeah.
There's no other way to look at it. It's war.
Which, I believe that when we posted that you were going to be on, someone made mention about the fact that there were there brothers on opposite sides that were actually warring. So obviously that was something that was happening.
And it's all basically individual choices about your obligation. There's no official things coming from lodges at the beginning of the war. Eventually, the Grand Lodges kind of actually do go along political lines. At first, it's just, Masons we don't have an official opinion as Masons. A lot of lodges disband because so many are either going to war or, have to go back across north or south. And a lot of lodges close because of the war. And then eventually you have, something like the Grand Lodge of Virginia saying, that you have a duty to protect your country, meaning Virginia. But there absolutely were brothers that knew each other, not including General Armistead and General Hancock.
Didn't you have a question about a specific Confederate?
I certainly do.
Is he your favorite Confederate?
Well, I try to emulate him slightly.
Yeah.
Would you talk to us
about your favorite Confederate?
About my favorite?
Yeah. So General Albert Pike, okay, the most controversial,
of course,
figure, and he's controversial outside of Masonry. One of the reasons he was controversial outside of Masonry is he was successful in getting a lot of Native Americans to fight on the Confederate side. He was doing a lot of work out in the Western theater of the war. And so Union troops in Arkansas specifically went to go burn his house down. And that was known to have a huge Masonic library in it, of course. And there's a Colonel Benton went and said, "That's my headquarters," and made sure that to save that house as his own and make sure that that didn't happen.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is there any other stories in regards to Albert Pike?
Not about Pike. Not about Pike during the war that I have that really stand out to me. There's a lot of interesting stories about saving the jewels. There was a Tyler that was really doing his duty during the siege of Richmond, that he gathered all the jewels from all these lodges and put it in the Grand Lodge building and then stood with his sword outside, and there's shells going left and right, and of course huge amounts of Richmond burned down, but he made sure he protected the jewels. Yeah.
I think it's something when we look at the past. It's interesting because we're talking about brother versus brother, and in a literal sense in some cases. And this war, is a 4-year war, but a lot happened within those 4 years.
Yeah.
Was there anything that stood out to you during that period that was an aha moment for you, or something that really took precedent for you?
Sorry, I need you to elaborate where you're going.
Well, in regards to these stories,
okay,
was there any specific areas where people were more Masonic here versus over here that they kind of weren't?
Yeah.
Was it specific generals that were really upholding their end of the bargain?
Yeah, I get where you're going now. I think what it taught me, if that's the question, or what really stood out to me, is that question of where does your obligation begin and end? What would you do?
Correct.
And where, at what point are you risking your life more than would be
an average soldier?
Yeah. And what would you actually do for someone with nearly the opposite political opinions of yourself, but you knew he was a brother Mason?
Correct.
And so that's what the great part of reading these stories is, because it's a terrible war, and really great examples of humanity in it.
Exactly. And I think if we could look at it in today's eyes,
I was thinking the same
with
thing.
what's going on right now,
Yeah.
is our country is very divided, right? And within our lodge, I mean, we have brothers who are on both sides. You know, we have folks who are Republican, folks who are Democrat, those are in the middle. But we leave that at the door. You know, I mean, although I know this person is going down this political path, and for me, it's just not my thing. But we could sit down and have a real conversation about life and help each other out and do things for each other and really be brotherly, right? Taking that same thought back into a time where there was no social media, there were no electronics, everything was done paper and pen or quill. It's interesting that a lot of this stuff was still recorded.
Yeah.
You know, and for me, it's like you said, I really don't know anything. There's just so much reference, but at the same time, where do you start putting all these stories together within that 4-year span? It's crazy, man.
But yeah, when I give this talk, because I've given this talk to lodges all around California, I ask them, do you have friends today, right now, that are of the opposite political opinion of you? You know, do you have brothers? Can you civilly talk with them? And you kind of have the same questions come up, you know, and at what point would you be willing to risk your life? You know, and what rules are you willing to bend?
Yeah.
What duty is the most important to you?
I think it really comes down to what does the obligation mean to you personally, and how far are you willing to take it? And in these examples, we've seen guys really put their lives on the line for somebody else, and where they probably shouldn't have.
Yeah.
You know, but you know that's what we do as Masons. We look after each other. We make sure we do the right thing, right? In darkness, there is light.
So I have one more anecdote.
Tell me.
One more anecdote. There were also a lot of great examples of soldiers that were prisoners, you know, because the prison system was absolutely horrible on both sides. There were atrocities on both sides. You know, Andersonville is still in our lexicon. We still, know Andersonville as a bad thing. And there were examples of Masonic charity going back and forth, even at Andersonville, getting a little bit of extra food to that prisoner or maybe letting him go.
Can you tell me why Andersonville was so bad?
Oh, Andersonville, for those that don't know, Andersonville was a rudimentary prison, more of a stockade that held way more Union soldiers than it should have, with disgusting conditions, no sanitation. Sometimes the water trough running through the middle was both drinking water and sanitation. They have the deadline from it where they would put, food on one part of the line, but you weren't allowed to cross it or you get shot. There's all kinds of horrible stories from Andersonville, and some of the most striking photos of the Civil War are taken from the Andersonville prisoners. They look like concentration camp victims because it was a concentration camp. The exact same situation. Often it was a concentration camp, and there were atrocities by the Federal Army against Confederates. There were terrible northern prisons that were equally bad. But just as I brought you all the way down, there's a great story from a former Andersonville prisoner. And he wasn't a Mason during the war, but he said he saw Masonic kindness happen during the war and during his stay at Andersonville. And he said, "There are many things that I must do after this war. I have to visit many of these foreign countries described to me. Wear silk underwear and join the Masons." Those are his 3 things.
Wear silk underwear.
Wear silk underwear. He's heard great things about it. And join the Masons.
So did Masonry influence the way that prisoners of war were treated moving forward after that? Did it have any?
I don't
any
think
control?
I think there were actually compassion, but I think the atrocities themselves
Or what influenced?
were what influenced our conduct. But again, we had terrible atrocities in the Indian Wars, in the Spanish-American War. We didn't learn a lot of lessons prison-wise. But there were those shining examples of Masonic charity, even in the darkest parts of the war. But now we know, gotta wear silk underwear. Gotta join the Masons. Yeah.
Well, I've never tried.
Gotta
silk
get me some
underwear
of that,
myself,
right?
but
Well, maybe that's the key.
I think that's the key to life, right?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes. Wisdom from the
comfortable.
1860s.
Wear silk
Wear
underwear.
silk
Yes.
underwear.
Visit these foreign countries. Wear silk underwear. Join the Masons.
What is that book that you have right there?
Well, this is a tangible piece of history, and should I be invited back, I'll also talk about it again. But this is actually an 1865 Book of Constitutions. So this Book of Constitutions was around during the Civil War,
Oh, wow.
and that's one of my favorite Masonic books. But it's a Grand Lodge of England book constitution, so it wasn't in America during the Civil War, but it was
From the era.
its period.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you have anything else to add?
I don't have anything else to add. If anybody wants to hear my Masonic history talk, I'm around. Lord Rivers on Instagram, and historicinsights.com is my consulting company.
Lord
But
Rivers.
Do you have any lodges that you're going to be talking at anytime
I
soon?
have no plans coming up. I'm all open.
He's open, guys.
Yes.
book 'em?
Yes.
Book him.
Or if you don't book me, I'll just keep talking to my own lodge, and they're gonna have a problem. They'll be bored to death.
I doubt they'll be bored to death,
Yes.
because for me, this is always good information, regardless of how much you talk, which I'd like to hear it. I like to, and I'm pretty sure a lot of our fans are people who just want to know more information about history and things that happened. And to me, it's very important, and I think you're very important to Masonry. You give it back in a way that not many people can, and I think that's how we all bring different flavors to the craft, where we're educating and we're bringing back history, and we're talking about these things. And I think it's educational. It's you're a historian, and it's a great thing to have, and I'm honored to have you on the show.
Oh, it's an
Thank
honor to
you
be
very
on the
much.
show.
Absolutely.
I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up right here.
Yep.
Thank you for tuning in. We have a couple more shows coming up. We're talking about our Mystic Lantern lecture series.
Got some events.
We got some events with the Mystic Lantern lecture series. We also have Esotericon coming up. Those things are happening very soon. February 28th is the Mystic Lantern, and Esotericon is October 17th. And tickets are already on sale, so get yours now. Anything else you want to add, sir?
I want to thank the Long Beach Scottish Rite for allowing us to be here, have a home. Hermes Lodge will be rolling right in this room that you are watching us in tonight. So that's an awesome thing.
Yes.
And
This has
want to say thanks.
been our labor of love, right?
That's for sure.
Another thing is the SoCal Fashion Show here at the Long Beach Scottish Rite, I believe, is in March. If you want to check that out, I think it's SoCalFashionShow.com, and it will be held here at the Long Beach Scottish Rite. You could go to our website. We'll give you some more information there, and we'll also post it on Instagram and Facebook. But for right now, this is Mike, Red Dragon, and Cowboy Jesus, and Darrell. Thank you very much.
Coming to you from the Northeast corner.